The River Inn flowed quietly through the border town of Braunau. It was April 20th, 1889, a cold dawn in the heart of Austria. Inside a small house near the church, a child cried for the first time. His name was Adolf Hitler. No one knew then that this fragile infant would one day ignite the darkest chapter of human history. His father Alois carried a secret even before his son took his first breath. He had been born out of wedlock. His mother, Maria Schickelgruber, never revealed who the real father was. The church records were blank. Decades later, the name Johann Georg Hiedler appeared, as if history itself had been rewritten, and with it came a new surname. Hitler, a single change of ink, and a new legacy was born. His mother, Clara Pölzl, was gentle and deeply religious. She loved her son with quiet devotion, yet she too carried the weight of family secrets. She was a distant relative of her husband, bound by blood and by fate. In her silence, a storm was growing, one that the world would soon face. The roots of the Hitler family reached deep into the Austrian soil. Farmers, servants, and millers, ordinary people, living quiet lives. But from that soil, something darker began to grow. Some said there was a hidden branch, whispers of Jewish ancestry, of secrets buried in old villages. Historians searched for proof and found only silence. The truth lay tangled in shadows, somewhere between myth and memory. By the time Adolf was a boy, his family name had already changed, his destiny already written. No one could have known that the child born under a false name would one day command nations and destroy millions. The story of his bloodline was not just about who he was, but about what humanity would become when history lost its conscience. Alois Hitler ruled his household like a soldier commands a camp. He demanded order, obedience, and discipline, qualities his young son never possessed. Adolf loved to draw. He filled his notebooks with castles, soldiers, and cities he imagined. But when he showed them to his father, Alois's voice thundered across the room. An artist? Nonsense. You will serve the empire, not waste your life with colors. Each harsh word became a wound. The boy began to retreat, not into silence, but into a world of dreams and defiance. Every punishment he endured carved a scar deeper than the last. When his younger brother Edmund died, something inside Adolf broke. The laughter that once filled their home vanished into silence. Clara wept for days, and the boy, only 10 years old, watched helplessly. Death had entered his world too soon. He clung to his mother, the only light left in his life. At school, his teachers saw only a distracted child, but inside him, grief had already begun to harden into anger. In Linz, young Adolf became a rebel. He refused to follow the rules, mocked his teachers, and spent hours daydreaming of power and greatness. While others dreamed of careers, he dreamed of destiny. At home, the battles continued. His father's cane and shouts echoed through the rooms. Adolf's anger burned quietly beneath the surface. When Alois died suddenly in 1903, the boy felt no tears, only a strange, forbidden relief. The shadow that had ruled his life was gone. After his father's death, Adolf moved to Vienna with one burning dream: to become an artist. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, confident that talent would open the gates of destiny. But when the rejection letter came, it was as if the world itself had closed its doors. "Your drawings lack life," the professors wrote. He stood in the cold streets of Vienna, holding that letter, the first official denial of his existence. From that moment, disappointment turned to bitterness. Vienna, the city of art, music, and dreams, became his prison. He lived in shelters, sold postcards, and often slept beneath bridges when he could not afford a bed. He watched the elegant citizens of Vienna pass him by, their laughter echoing in the cold air. In that silence, hatred began to take root. He searched for someone to blame, and for his hunger, his failures, his pain. And in the shadows of that great city, bitterness found its voice. In 1907, his mother, Clara, fell gravely ill. Adolf sat by her side for weeks, refusing to leave her bedside. When she died in December, he was shattered. He later said that it was the darkest day of his life. At her funeral, he stood motionless, tears frozen, emotions buried. The gentle warmth that had once kept his humanity alive was gone. All that remained was emptiness. By 20, Adolf Hitler was a man without a family, without a home, and without hope. He wandered the streets of Vienna, a failed artist, a forgotten dreamer. But deep inside, a transformation had begun. Pain became ideology, suffering became justification, and the boy who once loved art began to see the world not in colors, but in enemies. History often asks, was he born evil, or was he made so by the world around him? The answer hides in those lost years, in the cold streets of Vienna, in the death of his mother, in the rejection of his dreams. Before the dictator, there was a boy. Before the war, there was a wound. And before the hatred, there was heartbreak. In Vienna's shelters, he met people from every corner of the empire. Germans, Jews, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles. He listened, observed, and judged. It was here that his early prejudices began to form. He admired the powerful speeches of nationalist politicians and read anti-Semitic newspapers that were popular in Vienna at the time. Slowly, the bitterness of failure mixed with resentment. The dream of being an artist was fading, replaced by something darker, the belief that destiny had chosen him for another purpose. By 1913, he had saved a small amount of money from his street art sales. He decided to leave Vienna behind and move to Munich, Germany. Munich was cleaner, calmer, and more German, as he liked to say. He wanted to start over, to become an artist, perhaps an architect. But soon the drums of war echoed across Europe. The assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 set the world on fire. When war began, Hitler volunteered for the German army. Despite being an Austrian citizen, he was accepted into the Bavarian regiment. For him, it was a new chance, a purpose. He served as a messenger on the Western Front, carrying messages between dangerous trenches. He faced mud, hunger, and death daily. Yet, he believed he had finally found belonging among soldiers who fought for the same flag. In 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, he was wounded in the leg. He spent weeks in a military hospital only to return to the front again. In October 1918, near the end of the war, a British gas attack blinded him temporarily. Lying in a hospital in Passewalk, he learned that Germany had surrendered. He wept, not just for the lost war, but for what he believed was the betrayal of his nation. For him, the collapse of the empire was not the end, it was a sign. He felt chosen by fate to restore Germany's honor. In the dim light of the hospital ward, the failed artist, the rejected student, and the wounded soldier became something else. He began to believe he had survived for a reason, that his suffering had meaning. The young man who once dreamed of painting cathedrals now dreamed of rebuilding a nation. In 1919, he was sent by the army to observe a small political group, the German Workers' Party. He went as a spy, but he stayed as a believer. He saw in their ideas the reflection of his own rage, against the Treaty of Versailles, against the politicians, against everything that had humiliated Germany. And when he spoke, people listened. They saw in him something dangerous, something magnetic. By 1920, the party had a new name, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and its meetings grew larger, louder, more theatrical. Hitler stood on the stage, under the harsh lights, his voice trembling with fury. He spoke of unity, strength, and destiny. He promised to lift Germany from its knees. He found in politics what the battlefield could not give him: purpose. He learned the power of symbols, the red banners, the swastika, the raised hand. He learned how to make a crowd weep, cheer, or rage with a single gesture. Each speech was a performance, each audience a rehearsal for history. In those smoky halls, a movement was born. It started small, just voices and dreams, but behind those voices, the machinery of something darker began to turn. Hitler was no longer a lost soldier. He had found his war again, not with guns, but with words. And so, the artist from Vienna, the soldier from the trenches, became the orator of Munich. The stage was set. Germany was listening, and the world had no idea what was coming. It was January 30th, 1933. Germany had fallen into despair. Factories were silent, millions wandered the streets jobless, and democracy seemed broken beyond repair. Then, Adolf Hitler, a man once dismissed as a fanatic, was sworn in as chancellor. As he stood beneath the black, white, red flags of the old empire, a new power was born, and the echo of cheering crowds drowned out the last breaths of the Weimar Republic. Only weeks later, flames devoured the Reichstag building. Smoke rose over Berlin, and fear swept across the nation. Hitler declared the fire a communist plot and demanded emergency powers. With one decree, freedom of speech, press, and assembly vanished. Germany had traded liberty for the illusion of security. In March 1933, the Enabling Act was passed. Parliament surrendered its power to one man. Hitler no longer needed persuasion, only obedience. Opposition parties were dissolved, unions crushed, and the Nazi flag rose over every institution. Germany's democracy had not been destroyed in battle. It had signed its own death certificate. Concentration camps were built, first for political enemies, later for all who were different. The Gestapo listened, watched, and whispered in every neighborhood. Neighbors feared each other, and silence became survival. The swastika waved not only in the wind, it lived in every trembling heart. Even within his own movement, shadows of rebellion grew. The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, dreamed of revolution, but Hitler dreamed of control. In June 1934, under the dark veil of night, the Führer's orders brought death to his old comrades. Blood cleansed the ranks, and fear sealed his throne. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler united all power under his name. He became the Führer, the leader of the German people. Every soldier swore an oath, not to the nation, but to him personally. The destiny of millions now rested in the will of one man. Joseph Goebbels filled the airwaves with Hitler's voice. Posters portrayed him as savior, messiah, warrior. At the Nuremberg rallies, seas of people moved as one, their cries echoing into the heavens. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. The illusion of unity masked the reality of control. Factories roared again, highways stretched across the land, and unemployment fell. The people celebrated what they called the German miracle. But beneath the pride and progress, tanks were built instead of tractors, bullets instead of bread. Germany was not healing, it was rearming. In defiance of the Versailles Treaty, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland. Europe did nothing. Then he turned to Austria, his homeland, and annexed it in 1938. Crowds cheered, unaware that the map of Europe was being redrawn in blood. By 1939, the Nazi flag flew from the Baltic to the Alps. The Führer stood before his generals, eyes burning with ambition. He spoke of destiny, of revenge, of a 1,000-year empire. And as the world watched in uneasy silence, Germany's armies prepared to march east. The storm had not yet broken, but thunder was already in the air. The darkness that had risen within Germany was now ready to engulf the world. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, the world had awakened to the sound of war. German forces had crossed the Polish border with tanks, artillery, and thunderous air raids. Within days, Warsaw had been bombed, cities had fallen, and thousands had fled in terror. Britain and France had declared war on Germany, but Hitler had already achieved what he wanted. The world had entered an age of fire. The German army had introduced a terrifying new strategy, Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. Tanks had crushed resistance before it could form. The Luftwaffe had darkened the sky with endless squadrons. In only weeks, Poland had fallen. By the end of the year, Europe had realized that an unstoppable force had risen in Germany. By the spring of 1940, Hitler had turned west. Denmark and Norway had fallen within days, and the German army had poured through the Ardennes into France. In only 6 weeks, Paris had surrendered. German troops had marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe, while Hitler had stood before the Eiffel Tower, silent, smiling, victorious. The world had witnessed the collapse of one of Europe's greatest nations. That same year, Hitler had prepared to invade Britain. The Luftwaffe had bombed London and its cities night after night. turning the sky into fire. Yet the Royal Air Force had fought back with courage and desperation. For the first time, Hitler's advance had been stopped. The island had remained unbroken, its people unbent. In the summer of 1941, Hitler had turned eastward. He had betrayed his pact with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million soldiers had crossed into the Soviet Union. Cities had burned, millions had died, and yet victory had slipped through his fingers. The Russian winter had frozen his dreams, his armies, and the myth of invincibility. The fire that had spread across Europe now began to burn the empire that had ignited it. By 1942, Hitler's empire had stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga, but beneath its surface, cracks had begun to form. In North Africa, Rommel's forces had been halted at El Alamein. In the east, the Red Army had begun to push back. The war that had once been swift and triumphant had now turned into a storm that Germany could no longer control. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army had fought to the last bullet. What Hitler had called a symbol of strength became a monument of ruin. Over 300,000 soldiers had been trapped, starved, and destroyed. When the survivors had finally surrendered, the illusion of invincibility had died with them. From that moment on, the Reich had begun to fall. By 1944, Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The beaches of France had echoed with gunfire and courage. From the west, the Allies had advanced. From the east, the Soviets had marched relentlessly. Germany had been surrounded, and the Reich that once promised 1,000 years had begun to crumble in its 12th. By April 1945, Berlin had become a city of ashes. Soviet guns thundered across the horizon as the capital burned. In his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler had faced the end of his empire and of himself. He had spoken of loyalty, of fate, of sacrifice. Then, as the walls trembled above him, he had taken his own life. On May 8, 1945, Germany had surrendered. The swastika that once hung over Europe had fallen. The cities lay in ruins, the people in silence, and the dream of a 1,000-year empire had ended in 12. The world had stood in mourning, not for the Reich, but for the millions whose lives it had consumed. In the dying light of a collapsing empire, deep beneath the burning streets of Berlin, Adolf Hitler had written his final words. The walls had trembled with distant explosions as he dictated his testament, one for politics and one for himself. He had blamed the generals for their failures, the people for their weakness, and the world for his defeat. He had appointed Admiral Dönitz as his successor, the last echo of a dying Reich. Even in his final words, he had clung to hatred, declaring that the struggle against the Jews must continue beyond his death. His empire had fallen, but his delusion had endured until the end. Then, he had signed another, a personal will. He had declared his marriage to Eva Braun and ordered that both their bodies be burned, so that no enemy could ever display them. In those final lines, there had been no remorse, no reflection, only control. And when the ink had dried, he had set his pen aside and prepared for the end. On the following day, April 30th, 1945, as the Soviet army closed in, Adolf Hitler had ended his life. Above him, Berlin had burned, and with it, the Third Reich. All that had remained were his ashes and the warning they carried for all time. Her empire, born of hatred, burns in its own fire.